who's the father of John the Baptist, and that's part of the Christmas story. The shepherds, right, who have those angels show up in the night. Every message that they receive is about considering a better tomorrow, that God is coming, that he's dwelling among us to make things right. Hope is one of these things that pushes us to consider our future. And in all of these situations, hope actually needs suffering in order to exist. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans chapter 8, you don't need to turn there, I'll read it for us. But he makes this argument pretty clear. He lays this out pretty clearly. In chapter 8, verse 18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. Paul, in Romans chapter 8, and this isn't the only place he does this, he makes the connection between suffering and hope. And that hope is waiting for that thing we don't have yet. Hope it's waiting for that thing that will make things right. And he compares suffering to a woman in labor. Not only the suffering of the entire created world, but our own groanings are akin to a woman in labor. I had the privilege of being in the room when all three of my children were born, and I can tell you that is probably one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do, is watching somebody that I love and care for in so much pain, and there is nothing you can do. And yet the child that comes just kind of, I don't know, it almost puts that suffering on the back burner. It's like, okay, this is what this was all about. Right? And Paul is making that connection that when we suffer, it's like childbirth. There is something good coming, but when we hope, we're hoping for something we don't have yet. We don't have yet. I read a book this year on suffering and grief, and it was one of the best books on suffering and grief I've ever read. It was called The Deepest Place. And in the first few pages of the first chapter, the author, Kurt Thompson, he discloses that you probably picked this book up on suffering for the same reason I would pick up a book on suffering. And that is because you want the suffering to go away. And you want to figure out what's the quickest way to get through this, to make it all better. And unfortunately, that's not how this works. And he then takes the whole rest of the book to work through Romans 5, where Paul talks about the connection again between suffering and hope. And he talks about how suffering leads to perseverance, perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope. That hope doesn't exist. We don't get to hope unless we persevere through suffering and allow it to mold and shape our character. This is part of the Christmas story, and there's actually a moment in the Christmas story that is full of suffering and pain. And I know maybe you didn't come to church this morning expecting to receive a message like this, but we can't dissociate hope from suffering. And in Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 2, which is where we're going to be spending the bulk of our time this morning, we read a story that we tend to kind of gloss over at Christmas, and I think we need to sit with it, because Matthew is actually giving us a blueprint at the end of this story to how to cultivate hope in the midst of suffering and difficulty. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 begins like this. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." And when King Herod heard heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem, in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go to worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed, and on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Let's pause here. There's so many things in this story that I want to unpack. But I just want to highlight a few things that I think are worth mentioning this morning. First, every time I read this, one of the things that jumps out to me is how varied God's communication is, right? You got the wise men, these magi, good chance they're Gentiles, who have like no less than 4 different ways that God communicates to them, right? You've got a star, you've got the community of the chief priests and the teachers of the law. You've got scripture. You've got a dream, right? Like God is using all sorts of different ways to communicate to the Magi, to make it clear to them what the next play is. And I find that so encouraging, so reassuring. God will communicate clearly. And there might be ways that he'll communicate to one person that don't seem quite right, like stars, right? Why would that communicate? What does that, how is that communicating to the Magi? That the King of the Jews, the King of Kings is born, right? Like, what is going on with that? And yet the Magi make the connection. There was something about that moment, that astronomical moment that cemented in the minds of the Magi that something divine and special had occurred. And we know that it was something divine because they worship Jesus when they show up. They understood that there was something more at play about the birth of Jesus than just he was a king, right? They worship him when they arrive. They know that he's a divine king. And so God has a whole pile of ways he communicates. Take comfort in that. If you're seeking God and you want direction in life, he will communicate in a way that is clear, in a way that is clear to us. But we're also introduced to a bit of an insidious character, a man by the name of King Herod. This is likely the same King Herod who built the temple in Jerusalem. We're told a few things about him in this passage that should kind of put up some red flags, right? We're told that King Herod, when he hears the news about this king that's been born, is disturbed. He doesn't like this very much. When he meets with the Magi later on in the text, he meets with them secretly. Why the secrecy? Especially if this is somebody you want to go worship as well, right? What's going on here? King Herod seems a little off. Well, written history tells us and reinforces that King Herod was off. He was a tyrant. King Herod, when the Roman Empire took over a nation, they would try to preserve as much of the local government as they could. It was actually a really good move on their part. It's what allowed them to hold so much territory. They might replace some people who held different offices and replace them with people who would submit to Rome and submit to the empire. But by and large, they tried to work with the local government as much as they could. And King Herod, before he was king, Herod is this half Jew, half Gentile, who seems to be a wealthy man, who as soon as Rome comes in and takes over Jerusalem, beelines it to Rome, cozies up to Caesar Augustus, and convinces Caesar Augustus, Israel has always had a king, you need to make me king, and I'll give Rome whatever they want. And this is the guy who's put in power. So he goes away for a little while, goes to this emperor, the emperor bequeaths the kingship of Israel to him, and he goes back home, and he starts using religion to control the people. That's one of the reasons he rebuilds the temple. He also did not hesitate to execute anyone who threatened his rule and reign, including some of his own children. This guy is a bloody tyrant. He is the definition of that. And he was likely known in Matthew's day, and everybody knew the kind of reputation King Herod had. So when they hear that this guy is part of this story, there should be some unease as we read about him and the way he's trying to interact with the Magi. And I would love it if the story ended there. We're introduced to this tyrant king. His plot is foiled. God communicates to the Magi, right? Don't go back to Herod. You need to go another route. And it was all nice and tidy with the Magi there, with the frankincense and the gold and the incense, right? Like, that would be a great end to this Christmas story. Unfortunately, it's not. And in fact, what comes next is one of the most brutal moments of the Christmas story. Verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." And after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." Let's pause there. Pain, suffering, the cost of Jesus being born in Bethlehem was the loss of a bunch of boys 2 years and under. And in the midst of it all, in the midst of this incredible, brutal moment, Matthew has the audacity to quote prophecy. If you remember anything from our sermon series in the book of Matthew, when we've been talking about discipleship, anytime Matthew brings in an Old Testament passage, we need to pay attention, because he's actually telling us more than just this is fulfilling a prophecy. He's actually trying to give us insight into what God is up to and what God is doing. And that is no less true of these two prophecies. These two prophecies that are quoted, one from Hosea and one from Jeremiah, don't have anything to do with Messiah. They have nothing to do with the Messiah. When you read them, Messiah is not even on their radar. Right? Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Hosea it's a really great book. I really like it for a number of reasons. It has some very compelling word pictures of God and his relationship with his people. At one point, it talks about God being the nation of Israel is a heifer who has never been yoked. And they exhort Israel, the heifer, to put on your yoke and break up the hard hearts. Break up your hard hearts. Start tilling that soil and get your hard hearts ready to receive the words of God. Wow, what a compelling image. Another point, God is described as this mother bear whose cubs have been threatened. Oh, you don't corner a mother bear, a cubs when mama's around, right? And that, it kind of leaves you hanging in a point of tension, like, oh snap, what's God gonna do if he's a mother bear with cubs cornered? But by and large, the two pictures that are used to describe God in the book of Hosea are introduced to us in the narrative that starts at the beginning of the book. And this is a narrative that frames the entire oracle, all of the prophecies, all of the poetry that Hosea uses to communicate the words of God. And the narrative is God calling Hosea the prophet to marry Gomer, who's an unfaithful prostitute. And it's unclear whether she was a prostitute before or after the marriage. It's a little vague on those details, but he goes and he marries her. Sure enough, she's unfaithful. He has to buy her off of a slave block and then takes her away and pulls her away and takes her into the wilderness, which becomes this picture of the unfaithfulness of Israel, and God is the loyal, faithful spouse who's willing to do anything to restore relationship. The second picture is a little bit more subtle in the narrative, but Gomer and Hosea have children, and these children have weird names, and they're all names that depict the rebellion of Israel. And God almost seems to be suggesting, like, the other relationship that's at play, the other picture is God being a good parent whose children are rebelling, and they're not paying attention to him, and they're doing whatever they want. And they're disobeying God. And so when we approach Hosea 11, we need to ask which word picture is at play. Is it the relationship one, the marriage one, or is it the child one? And in Hosea 11, Hosea and God are unpacking the child relationship. And when we read Hosea 11, chapter 1, Hosea is looking back at the Exodus. And he's talking about, like, Israel, do you not realize you're God's firstborn child? And do you not recognize the lengths that God took to get you up out of Egypt, to bring you into the promised land, to plant you in a good land where you could prosper? And God gave you basically everything you would ever need, and you've taken all of it and done whatever you wanted. You're like the prodigal son that we read about in the book of Luke. You've just squandered and wasted all of it. This is why you need to be exiled. The Exodus. The Exodus wasn't just a moment where God stepped in and saved Israel. It was a process. It was a process that started when Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gets threatened by the people of God, Israel, his slaves. And so he has, tell me if this sounds familiar, all of the firstborn children 2 years and under executed and killed one night. Does that not sound familiar to what we're reading here in Matthew? About a king who gets threatened and angry and frustrated and has all the children 2 years and under executed. You see, Matthew is actually seeking to give us a blueprint for hope, to how to cultivate hope in our lives. That's why he's quoting from Hosea chapter 11. And he wants us to remember the Exodus. Remember this moment where this happened to the people of God once before, where an angry tyrant executed our children. And God had a plan to save one child. God saved Moses. God saves Jesus. And he uses Moses to go back into Egypt to bring people out of Egypt, to bring his people out of Egypt. But that was a process. It wasn't like Moses just showed up one day, knocked on the door of Pharaoh's kingdom, right? Pharaoh's door, Pharaoh's mansion, and said, "Hey, can you let the Israelites go?" And Pharaoh said, "Yeah, okay, we've gotten enough out of them. Go ahead, leave," right? There was a process to that. There's a process to that. In fact, at the end of Exodus 1, after you hear about the death of the children and their slave labor becomes worse, right? They have to do more. The work becomes harder. We're told that they cried out to God, and it would still take 40 years before Moses came on the scene because Moses wasn't ready to partner with God yet. And so Moses disappears for a while, and then he comes back after God calls him. And even when he shows up, there's a process. There are 10 plagues that they have to go through. God declares war on the Egyptian pantheon. And those plagues weren't exclusive to Egypt. Do you realize some of the plagues impacted Israel as well? And that they were suffering right alongside the Egyptians at different points. In fact, there's one point in chapter 6 where the Israelites cry out to Moses and they're like, "Get God to stop. This is awful. This is horrible. We can't take this." And they're only at like plague 2, right? They're like, "We've had enough. We don't want this." When we cried out to God, this is not what we asked for. And Moses is like, I can't get him to stop. And they go through all of the Exodus. It's a process. And we're told that the final plague, the 10th plague, was justice for the lives lost at the beginning of the book. It took over 40 years for justice to be served. But even when Pharaoh finally relents and he's like, yeah, go ahead, leave, there's a process to get to the promised land, isn't there? God leads them to the Red Sea. He doesn't lead them around the Red Sea. He leads them to the edge of the Red Sea while Pharaoh's army is coming down to kill them. And they know it. And they get to the edge of the Red Sea, and God has been leading them in that pillar of fire. And that pillar of fire moves from in front of them to behind the people of Israel and sets up this divine firewall to keep Pharaoh's armies at bay. And then you know what happens. The seas didn't part. It's in the text, Exodus 14. A wind started blowing, and it blew all night, and that's what parted the water. This was not a Charleston Heston moment, right? This was not Prince of Egypt. There was a process to part the water. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be Israel that night? To sit there, the only thing separating you from death is a wall of fire, and you don't know how long it's going to be there. And the only way to get life is to cross a deep ocean, a deep sea. And you're waiting. You hear this wind. You don't know how long it's going to take, right? Maybe Pharaoh's army will give up and leave, right? Or maybe the fire will stop burning, and then we're dead before the waters part. There is a process, and the Exodus story actually invites us to consider a God who enters into that suffering and enters into that process of suffering and difficulty and walks alongside his people through the suffering and the pain. And that's part of what God was trying to communicate in the book of Exodus. You see, this is what Matthew is doing when he tells us that this moment where Jesus escapes to Egypt it's reminding us, it's an echo of the Exodus, of this moment where something similar happened in human history and God intervened. And Matthew wants to give us a blueprint to cultivate hope. And he wants to recognize that the first way we cultivate hope in our lives is by remembering our past. Not just any past. We remember the past moments of God's divine intervention. We remember the past moments where God actually interceded, where God responded to a prayer, where God started doing something and working. This is the first way we cultivate hope. We remember our past. We remember our past. We remember the stories of what God has done in us and through us and around us. But what's interesting is Matthew chooses an event that happened probably about 1,500 years before. No, all the people who lived through the Exodus are dead, right? Sometimes we need a story that's old to begin cultivating hope. And this is why it's actually pretty critical that we share stories with each other of what God is up to, what he's doing, because we might actually need each other's stories, just like Bethlehem needed Israel's story when they were in slavery in order to find comfort and hope. It's critical that we share the stories of what God is doing in our midst. How is he moving? How is he responding to our prayers? How is he intervening? Because that might help us detect a pattern of what God might be doing in our present. Hey, Israel had this moment where a bunch of their children were executed and God preserved one child. Do you remember what that meant? It meant the Exodus. We're seeing something similar here. Bethlehem has lost all of their children and God preserved one child. Wow, there's freedom coming, right? They're seeing a pattern. They're not seeing a formula. We don't look for formulas because we can't manipulate God into doing what we want him to do. But we do look for patterns. What are the ways that God works and responds? And then we look for those moments in our lives. Is there something similar going on here that might suggest of what God might be up to and what he's going to do? So that's the first way we cultivate hope in the midst of suffering and difficulty. The second we find in the prophet Jeremiah. And we actually started our service off by reading the beginning of that oracle. That's how we kicked things off, was beginning with Jeremiah 31. And Jeremiah 31, by and large, Jeremiah is kind of a depressing prophet. But Jeremiah 31 is not one of those moments. It's actually really, really happy and really, really joyful. And there's a lot of just exciting things coming for Israel. It talks about the compassion of God being aroused, right? That's the same kind of language used to describe the anger of God being aroused. Imagine what that would be like for God's compassion to be aroused and what he might do. And Jeremiah is talking about a moment that is coming when God will heal us. He will turn our mourning into dancing, into gladness, right? That's where this whole idea of turning our mourning into song or our mourning into gladness, our mourning into dancing, that's where it comes from, Jeremiah 31. And yet in the midst of this excited moment, of this glad moment, of this joyful moment, we're then hit in verse 15. It just comes out of nowhere. And that's what Matthew quotes. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. You see, this prophecy, Jeremiah's talking about the present reality. This is what Israel has just experienced in the exile, the hands of Babylon. I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, I sanitize the exile. And I think that, in my mind, I picture it as, a group of soldiers showing up at my house, pulling my family out, putting us on a bus, taking all of our stuff, putting it in a truck to sell, and then that bus carries me to who knows where. I get dropped off, and I'm told to start a new life. And that's not really how it went down. The exile was much worse. That would be awful if that were to happen. But the exile was actually horrid. And it was violent. And there are prophecies in the Old Testament where God lambasts the way Assyria and Babylon exiled his people. And he tells them, you took this way too far. You were far too violent than I ever wanted you to be. Assyria and Babylon sought to break you emotionally, psychologically, culturally. Assyria in particular would, if you weren't one of the few who survived, would build a pyramid out of your heads. And they chose the heads of infants a lot of the time, right outside the city walls, so that where everybody would be able to see it and know, okay, this is what happens when we mess with Assyria. Babylon would play games with your infants. They would take a spear, stick it in the ground, point up, and they would try to play horseshoes with your child while you watched. They can't be comforted. That's what they've gone through. There's something, when we think about suffering and pain, Jeremiah doesn't whitewash it. He doesn't sanitize it. He recognizes there is tension in this oracle in Jeremiah chapter 31. Because as much as he's pumping up God's compassion and his desire to heal and change and bring renewal, he also recognizes the pain that they've undergone. It feels impossible to receive comfort right now. This is hard. This is hard. And so this is the other thing we need to recognize about cultivating hope. We don't sanitize suffering. We have to be open about what we're going through and the difficulty that we're facing. We don't try to dull it down. We don't try to, pump ourselves up by saying oh yeah, I can push through. It's okay to admit this is hard and to grieve and to recognize I don't know how I'm going to be comforted right now because it feels impossible. But then Jeremiah goes on to say right after this that if we want what he promised at the beginning of the chapter, we need to repent and humble ourselves. He's illustrating a bit of what Paul talks about in the book of Romans, that in order to receive hope for our future, we actually have to allow suffering and difficulty to shape who we are as a people and allow it to humble us and allow us to recognize if there's anything we need to repent of. God is in the business of forming character. He wants us to look like his son. There's only one place where Jesus is really clear what he's like. Most of the time, he's pretty vague. He's kind of cryptic. He uses words like Son of Man to describe himself. There's one point in the book of Matthew where he talks about himself as gentle and humble. And I find it fascinating that Jeremiah uses that word to describe the character that God is expecting from his people in Israel after the exile. He wants them to be humble. God desires us to develop humility, and he's willing to use suffering to do it. To bring us to a place where we go to God and we say, okay, I've been relying on too many other things. I want to rely on you now. Help me. And then God begins this process of comforting us, coming into the places that feel like they can't be touched, that they can't be comforted. And he'll come into those places and begin healing and restoring and renewing those things. So you see what Matthew is doing here? He's actually trying to give us a blueprint for discovering hope in the midst of suffering and pain. The first thing we have to do is we have to remember the stories of God's intervention. And as we remember those stories, we look for the patterns of what God has been up to in those moments and how that plays out in our present day. But then we also need to be honest about our suffering, honest about our difficulties, not so that we stay stuck in that suffering, not so that we stay stuck in that grief, but so that by exposing it, we can start recognizing the character that God is seeking to develop in us. And start going to God and recognizing I can't be comforted any other way except through you. And that's all based on the character of God, right? That's one of the things I loved about Jeremiah 31. He takes a lot of time to describe what God's character is really all about. He's compassionate. He's slow to anger. He's loving, right? Jeremiah uses the character of God to be able to have hope in our future. It's dependent on who God is like, what God is like, on his character. And as we engage with that, we start daring to imagine what he might do. Maybe he will turn my mourning into dancing. Maybe he will heal the things I don't think can be healed, because this is what he's like. And this is how he's done it in the past. This Christmas, as we've already talked about, mentioned a couple times this service, I'm very cognizant of the fact that this Christmas is going to be hard for some of us. It's going to be difficult. Many of us have been through a lot this year. Many of us are going through a lot right now. And the key to engaging with this is not to try to shortcut the suffering and get it to end. The key is actually to engage with the suffering, to recognize it's there, but then to have the audacity to think about what has God done in the past? What is God like? What is his character all about? And imagine what he might do as a result. Don't whitewash the pain. Don't whitewash the grief. Don't try to downplay it. Sit in that grief and let yourself work through the process of discovering God anew. Let's find hope together. Let me pray. Lord, we thank you that you are a courageous God, that you are a God willing to use unexpected moments and things and circumstances to do what we think would be the unthinkable, to actually bring healing, to actually bring restoration, to actually give us hope. Lord, I pray that we will develop the perspective that the Apostle Paul had, where he was able to say, suffering is like pains of labor, and it is awful and horrible, and it leads to groaning, and yet it's worth it when we realize what's coming. And I just pray that that will become a part of us, that we will be able to recognize that, not sanitize the pain or the suffering, but recognize how you are walking with us in it, so that we dare to hope and trust that there's a day coming when we will have what we lack. And I pray that in the midst of all of that, we will be willing to engage in this process that seeks to mold and shape our character, to make us more and more humble and gentle, loving and compassionate and merciful, more and more like you and your Son. Pray for this holiday season that not only as we engage with our own difficult situations, our own suffering, our own grief, but we will be willing to engage with the suffering and grief of others and help them get a new perspective on what you might be up to help them discover and cultivate hope in their own lives, even as we seek to develop it in ours. We thank you that you are so good. We thank you that you are so great. It's in your name we pray.